So today is the feast of St Mark, and it's always an important feast for me because I always remember this is the day when I was accepted formally as a seminarian to go on and be formed for the priesthood by Bishop Brain all those years ago, back in 2008. So it's a special day for me, but it's a wonderful patron to have, because this story of Mark, St Mark, we can piece together by just looking at the Acts of the Apostles. Reading the Acts of the Apostles is something that I would recommend to you in this Easter season anyway. But we can trace a little bit of Mark's story and how powerful his story still is for us today and how encouraging it is. Because, first of all, we see him, he's called John Mark. We believe it's the same Mark that wrote the Gospel, St Mark. He's called John Mark in the Acts of the Apostles. And we see that Peter and the other disciples use John Mark's mother's house for Mass and to stay and have dinner and everything. So she was obviously quite well off, and John Mark was there having contact with St Peter right at the beginning of the church and his ministry. We fast forward a little bit and we see that when Paul and Barnabas are together, the two apostles who are sent out to the Gentiles, they are given their mission and they decide to take John Mark with them as their secretary. So he goes off, so he's already had contact with St. Peter, and then he has contact with Paul as well, those two great pillars of the church. But then it just starts to go wrong a little bit, because when they are going somewhere quite dangerous, John Mark doesn't feel ready. Remember, he's still a young man, maybe not experienced a lot of the world yet. So when they are going off on a mission, he decides he's not ready and he wants to go home, go back to his mum's house. And that has repercussions, because we know how close Paul and Barnabas were, how well they got on together, how great they were working together on the mission. But the time comes just a little bit further in the future when John Mark feels ready again to go back on the mission. And Barnabas is all for it. He really wants John Mark to come back with them. After all, the name Barnabas means son of encouragement. That's where Barnabas probably got his reputation from, as this great encourager, seeing the best in people. But unfortunately, Paul disagreed with him. He thought John Mark had already bailed out on them once, so he wasn't going to let him possibly do that again. Perhaps Paul wasn't ready to give him a second chance. Perhaps that was one of Paul's flaws, that he couldn't see that John Mark had grown. So there's a bit of a falling out. Paul and Barnabas fall out, and then they go their separate ways. They no longer go on the mission together, no longer work together, and that's because of this person, John Mark. He goes off with Barnabas on the mission. Now, the end to the story, the encouraging thing is that this John Mark is also the Mark, as I said, that we believe is the potential author of the gospel that's attributed to Mark, whether it's he himself, that one person that wrote it, or even if it's a community that used the authority of Mark, it still shows how important his name was in the early church. And that failure, that apparent failure he had when he didn't feel ready to do what God was calling him to do at that point in his life, it comes to fulfillment. His vocation comes to fulfillment in the fact that we have that wonderful gospel, the gospel we believe was the first to be written, the gospel that we are still reading 2,000 years later because it's the inspired word of God. And it was this man, John Mark, St Mark, who was used as God's instrument. So it gives great encouragement to us all on our journey, and our vocation, our calling, when sometimes we fail, we stumble and fall. like John Mark, we can have chance after chance, and God will still use us for his purpose, because, as John Henry Newman says, God has given each and every one of us a definite thing to do that nobody else in the world can do. And St Mark is a great example of that.